Our speakers today are Danielle Doering, who's a master's student at the University of Kentucky studying integrated plant and soil science. Her research focuses on how cover crops can amend soil's physical properties and soil carbon. In 2020, she graduated with a bachelor's in natural resources and environmental science. She's passionate about food justice and environmental sustainability, and outside school, she likes to hike with her dog and play ultimate frisbee. Our other speaker is Hanna, help me out here, Poffenbarger? All right. She's an assistant professor of soil nutrient management at the University of Kentucky. She studies carbon and nutrient cycling in soil crop systems, sustainable soil management practices, and resilient production systems. Her specific areas of interest include nutrient capture and release by cover crops, spatiotemporal controls on nitrogen dynamics, optimal fertilization practices for crop yield and quality, and root impacts on soil organic matter formation and persistence. She's originally from Frederick, Maryland, and she completed her PhD at Iowa State University and has called Kentucky home since 2018. Please give them a round of applause, and let's hear what they have to say.
All right, I think all right. Well, thanks everybody for sticking around till the end of the day on Friday. So we're going to talk today about soil health and cover crops and system resilience. All right, so we're going to cover a few different topics. We're going to start by defining soil health and how it can impact system performance. We'll talk about cover crops as a tool for building soil health, how cover crops affect soil physical properties, how cover crops affect nitrogen cycling, and then we'll wrap up with some concluding thoughts. So what is soil health? So soil health is the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And so in our plant production systems, we're really concerned about whatever we can do to improve the soil to improve healthy plant growth. And particularly focusing on regulating water and cycling nutrients when we're considering all the different soil functions. And those are really the two that we'll talk about the most today. So soil health really encompasses more than just soil fertility. So soil fertility is more concerned with the chemical aspects, the pH, the nutrient content of the soil. But we recognize that a fertile soil is not necessarily a healthy or productive soil because you could have soil compaction that limits plant growth and root access to water and oxygen, or you could have just a biologically dead soil that is not really supporting nutrient cycling or providing the structure that comes from aggregate stability. And so with soil health, we're really thinking not only about soil fertility, but also about improving the biology and the physical structure of the soil. And so what does a healthy soil look like? So the figure on the left is showing a more healthy soil, and the figure on the right is showing a less healthy soil. A healthier soil typically has more organic matter. That's one of our best indicators of soil health. And so it'll usually be darker in color. We have better infiltration from the aggregates, the stable aggregates at the soil surface. Usually there's also more residue cover in a healthier soil, and that helps to slow down the movement of water, so you have more water infiltrating into the soil and less running off, so you have more effective rainfall. And with higher organic matter, you have a larger stock of nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, and so those are going to be mineralizing and becoming available for plant uptake. And so I like to think about healthy soils as providing a biological buffering, and that because they have better water holding capacity and nutrient supplying capacity, they can help the plants grow better even in cases of extreme weather, whether that's drought or a lot of ponding or saturated soil conditions. All right, so we've learned a lot about soil health from a long-term study at Spindletop Farm in Lexington. So this is a long-term no-till study. It began in 1970, and it was actually one of the studies that helped develop no-till as a system that we use widely today. But this system includes plowing every year versus continuous no-till. It's a continuous corn system that also has different nitrogen fertilizer rates. So about 3 or 4 years ago, the Soil Health Institute came to sample this site and collected a number of different soil health indicators. And this is just a few that stand out as very important indicators. So you can see the soil organic carbon was much higher in the no-till system. So not even a full percentage point, but this is quite a big difference actually, because it is hard to change soil organic carbon. Higher potential carbon mineralization, which is an indicator of the more easily decomposable forms of organic matter that really are food for the microbes. And then we have the higher wet aggregate stability as well, which is basically those aggregates, those clumps of soil that are at the surface, protecting the soil from erosion and allowing better water infiltration. So how does this soil health that we find in the no-till system translate into the system performance? So here we see a number of different yield indicators. That top value is yield with no nitrogen fertilizer. So this is just an indicator of the nitrogen supplying capacity of the soil itself. And we see here that the no-till system is mineralizing more nitrogen that's becoming available for the crop, leading to higher yields with no nitrogen and no-till. And then even when optimum nitrogen fertilizer is applied, we also see a yield benefit in the no-till system, which is an indication that it's probably also improving water holding capacity and water supply, because we basically manage this for no weed or disease or other limitations. So once the nitrogen is satisfied, we assume it's usually a water limitation. And then when we look at the yield per unit of fertilizer applied or the yield per unit of rainfall received, we see that the no-till system is functioning more efficiently in terms of resource use. And then another important indicator of the system actual resilience, how stable the yields are from one year to another. And we use a coefficient of variation to indicate this. So this is going to be higher where you have more variation in yield from one year to the next. So we see with the no-till system consistently lower coefficient of variation for all of these different parameters. So another indication the system is producing more and it's more reliable performance because of those soil health benefits. And then one other thing that we've just make observations during this season, and this is one that stood out to me last summer, where we had this really dry period in late June and early July, and we could really visually see how the corn in the tilled system, we see the classic like pineapple leaves of indicating the water stress, and that the plant is kind of slowing down its photosynthesis to cope with that. Whereas the no-till system, the leaves are more open, and so it's able to continue taking in carbon dioxide even in the dry conditions. So just another indicator of how soil health can translate into better tolerance for stresses. All right, so that was kind of our first topic, and we're going to take a quick poll as we transition over into our next topic about cover crops. And we're also going to transition speakers for a few minutes, so I'm going to bring Danielle up. Thanks.
So, just by a show of hands, how many of you guys have ever used cover crops? Whether you're a researcher or, cool. How many of you all have been using it for 1 year? I guess it'd be like the same amount. Keep your hand raised if you've been doing it for 2 years. Nice. What about 5 years? What about 10 years? Wow. That's awesome. So this is really cool because only about 5% of US cropland is using cover crops. So Kentucky is really unique in how many people are really using cover crops. You all must already know a lot about them, but just to quickly kind of go over different functional groups of cover crops, different species can go into different functional groups, but here I have listed just a few of the benefits that cover crops can have. So catch crops typically will kind of catch any remaining nutrients, whether that's like manure or fertilizer from your cash crop. Green manures can cycle in nitrogen, so through biological nitrogen fixation, they can provide nitrogen and have that available for your cash crop. Nurse crops can facilitate growth of your cash crop just by protecting the young plant from any elements. Smother crops smother weeds. They usually have a lot of biomass. Insectaries can be used to attract pollinators. Biofumigants can be used to ward off pests through like allelopathic properties. So like mustards are a good example of a biofumigant cover crop. And biodrilling is another functional group that can really help loosen up compact soil. So like that radish there can really help drill into the soil. So here we just have a diagram of how cover crops are used as a tool for soil health while they're growing. So just by the physical plant being there, it's providing soil cover through weeds and suppressing weeds and also controlling for erosion. If it's like a catch crop, it'll help retain any leftover nutrients. Soil loosening can occur even if you're not using one of those biodrilling cover crops. Just any sort of alive root system can really help with that soil loosening. And lastly, they also can be a habitat and food source for soil organisms, so any worms or fungi, microbes can really benefit from a continuous living crop. But lastly, of course, any sort of plant during growth is going to be using water and nutrients. So a big part of our research is all about how the benefits that we kind of list here can maybe outweigh the costs of water and nutrient usage. And even during decay, cover crops can really continue to provide benefits. Just by the tissues being there, they continue to add soil coverage, and that'll suppress weeds and control for erosion. They are habitat and food for soil organisms once again. They, as the earthworms kind of mix those decaying plants into the soil and the fungi really break them down, it's a really important food source for continuous microbe health. The extra surface area of those plants can help with water infiltration and protection and retention, just as kind of acting like a sponge. They help with aggregate formation and adding soil organic matter. And also, they eventually will release those nutrients and perhaps be available for your cash crop. Here we just kind of have a chart of different ways that cover crops might use your resources. So in the top left, we have some cover crops that use a lot of water, but they also cycle nitrogen, so it's not using a ton of nitrogen. So sun hemp and hairy vetch, or just any vetch. In the other top corner, we have some cover crops that use a lot of water and nitrogen, but they might provide other benefits like weed suppression. This bottom left corner, we have cover crops that don't use a lot of water and they also cycle nitrogen. And then lastly, we have the cover crops that don't use a lot of water but use a lot of nitrogen. So just to kind of find out what kind of cover crops people are using, just take a moment, kind of talk to the people next to you and say what kind of cover crops you guys use, or if you don't use any that you're thinking of using. And then in a minute, I'm going to ask some of you guys to share. So. Because, yeah.
Yeah, you can plant that pretty late, and
Yeah.
it'll take and go, and I use it where I plant beans and strawberries, and I put it in between the rows of my strawberry plants, and it actually pushes up and helps hold the cover up above the strawberries when they're starting to grow in the spring, and then you can ride it down, and it makes a good cover. It's, yes, and during in your aisles, so you're not walking in mud while you're picking strawberries.
Well, that kind of works as a nice transition into what I'm going to next, because I use cereal rye in one of my studies. So next I'm just going to go over the sort of physical properties that I measure in my cover crop study. I just have three sort of basic definitions here that I just like to go over to make sure we're all on the same page. So hydraulic conductivity is just how easily water moves through the soil. In a poorly structured soil, you're going to see more ponding at the surface, and in a more well-structured soil, the water will infiltrate through those pores with more ease. Bulk density is just how compact the soil is, sort of similar to hydraulic conductivity. When you have a more porous soil with different pore sizes, that's kind of thought to be a really good structure that water can infiltrate easily and roots can infiltrate more easily too. When you have a more compacted soil, so when your bulk density is higher, you might see a surface crust and some subsoil compaction that will really inhibit your root system and water as well. And aggregates are just, clumps of soil particles that are more attracted to each other. So that image, you can nicely see some soil aggregates. To measure them, we use something called mean weight diameter, which is just the average size of water-stable aggregates. So when water is introduced to an aggregate, is it going to stay together? And what is that average size? Usually, if we have more larger aggregates, we're seeing aggregates that are staying together even at a larger size. So aggregates are important because they protect organic matter from microbial degradation, and they increase soil porosity. Just the different sizes that fit together allow for a lot of pore spaces, so water will infiltrate, and it can also decrease bulk density, so it decreases the compaction. It can increase available water holding capacity as well, just by kind of holding on to some water inside of those aggregates, and it can also decrease erosion. So my study site is located at Spindletop North Farm Research Station in Lexington, Kentucky. It was established in 2015. It's a corn and soybean rotation. I will say it is not an organic system, but I think that what we learned from the cover crops in terms of physical health is still really applicable. So I have 4 winter cover management strategies to study. So we have a spring-killed cover crop, which is the cereal rye before soybean, and then we mix cereal rye and hairy vetch before corn. And we kill that in about March with an herbicide. The winter kill cover crop is oats before soybean and an oats crimson clover mixture before corn. The oats die in late December, early January, and that crimson clover does typically last through the spring as well. And then we have a weedy fallow. We just let whatever grow, and then kill any weeds with an herbicide as well in the springtime, and then a bare fallow where we treat it with an herbicide in the fall. So we don't let anything grow there. So here I just have demonstrated how much that cereal rye really adds to the carbon inputs. So the cereal rye has a lot more biomass than the oats do, so it is continuously adding more carbon to the system compared to the winter kill and compared to the weeds and bare fallow as well. So that green is the spring-killed cover crop. To measure hydraulic conductivity, we used a tension infiltrometer. And the tension infiltrometer is kind of a way that we can simulate water infiltration in a dry or a more saturated environment. So we kind of put these discs onto a flat soil surface, and the water holding columns can infiltrate the soil. So when we add a lot of tension to these tension infiltrometers, the water is really only entering in through the smallest pores. And so that's kind of simulating a really dry environment. And then when the tension is really low, the water is moving more freely and it's closer to saturation. So the water is entering through the larger pores. And now I'm just gonna go over some of my results from those physical properties. So all that explanation of a tension infiltrometer, but we did not see any significant results with the soil hydraulic conductivity. I think that has a lot to do with the fact that it is already a pretty well-drained system. All of the soils had moderate rate of water entry, regardless of the winter cover crop treatment. You can see on the x-axis at the 1, that is really close to fully saturated soil. And we have a high rate of hydraulic conductivity, which is expected. And then it gets slower as the soil becomes drier. Should that be concerning? Okay. We also, my phone might do that too. We also measured bulk density at 2 different depths. We kind of thought, since cereal rye is known to have like those really extensive root systems, that we might see some different results at deeper depths for some of the physical properties. That wasn't the case, so there was not a difference in bulk density for the deeper depth, the 17 to 23 depth. But at the surface, we are seeing a slight significant difference between the spring kill treatment and the weeds. It is not a huge difference, but after 8 years of cover cropping, we are seeing a slightly lower bulk density, which means that it's a little less compact. And we have our aggregates here as well. We also measured that at 2 different depths, and at the lower depth there wasn't a whole lot of aggregation, so there were not significant differences between the treatments. But we did start to see a significant difference between the aggregate stability of the spring-killed cover crop and the weeds. So The higher mean weight diameter means that there's more larger aggregates that are staying together when introduced to water. So the spring-killed cover crop, that cereal rye, is adding maybe more carbon to the system and kind of allowing for higher aggregation. And lastly, we have our yield data here. So this is the corn and soybean yield data in terms of how it compares to the bare fallow. So that 0 line is the yield of the bare fallow plot every year, and then the colored bars are how different each treatment compares. So we are seeing a moderate effect some years on the cover crop treatments, but the soybean, for example, we're not really seeing anything consistently. So last year, as you guys know, it was pretty dry, and the spring-killed cover crop actually had a pretty negative effect on the yield. About almost 30 bushels per acre less yield compared to the bare fallow. And we just kind of think that the spring-killed cover crop absorbed a lot of the water in the springtime, and it just never replenished throughout the summer. In 2020 with corn, we did see a more positive impact of the cover crop. The winter kill cover crop did have a significantly higher yield than the bare fallow. So as this study continues, we'll see if we see more of a trend and the differences in yield. So just some concluding remarks about the physical measurements. After 8 years of cover crop usage, we did see a difference between aggregate mean weight diameter between the spring-killed and the weeds, and also bulk density did decrease in the spring-killed cover crop, but the yield and soil hydraulic conductivity have not changed. And we only saw differences of the physical properties at the surface. And the spring-killed cover crop had more pronounced soil physical benefits than the winter-killed cover crop. And like I said, it does add a lot more biomass, but it's also around for almost 3 more months compared to the winter kill. So that could definitely play a role as well. So what are other studies showing? This paper was done by Blanco in 2020 and kind of just put together a bunch of different studies that were both short, medium, and long-term of different cover crop studies. So here I have in the red boxes what they have seen differences in. So the aggregate stability is slowly increasing with cover crop usage. Infiltration, even though we didn't really see anything with the water dynamics, they are seeing more increases in infiltration and saturated hydraulic conductivity. And I will also note that they're not seeing anything either with bulk density, and we did see a slight decrease in bulk density. And now we're going to transition from soil physics into some nutrient cycling, and I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Poffenbarger.
All right, so we have another survey question. Raise your hand for how much nitrogen cover crops can supply. How many people think zero nitrogen from a cover crop? How about 20 pounds per acre? 50 pounds per acre? 100 pounds per acre? Okay, all right, well, hopefully we'll answer this, at least based on the research that I've done, and provide some data. All right, so it's important to keep in mind, as Danielle mentioned, that we have effects of the cover crop both during the growth and during the decomposition. And when we think about the overall nitrogen effect of the cover crop, we have to think about the balance between the nitrogen use during growth and then how much of that is released back in a timely fashion for the next crop. And so that's kind of the balance that we'll be considering when we want to add up, what is the overall balance? Is it positive, neutral, or negative? Okay, so we have some data on nitrogen depletion by cover crops. So this is a few different studies that present how much soil inorganic nitrogen is present in the springtime following a cover crop versus following no cover crop. And just a reminder, the soil inorganic N is your pool of plant available nitrogen that'll be right there in the spring. So where you see the depletion ranging from 3 to 13 pounds per acre, that's just saying, following the cover crop, the soil is going to have anywhere from 3 to 13 pounds less plant available nitrogen than your no cover, which kind of makes sense. A lot of the reason we grow cover crops is to reduce the risk of nitrate losses. A lot of the nitrogen has been taken up and is in the biomass. We find the greater soil nitrogen depletion where we have bigger cover crops that have taken more nitrogen from the soil, and also in environments where that nitrogen would not otherwise be lost. So if we do have a dry spring, a lot of the nitrogen in the soil may still be there even if you don't have a cover crop. And so you see more of that depletion effect in dry years, dry springs. The other thing to keep in mind with the nitrogen depletion is your legume cover crops are really not going to deplete the soil in the same way that a non-legume cover crop would, because they're getting a lot of their nitrogen from the atmosphere. So you don't have as much of a nitrogen depletion during the growth phase for legumes. In terms of looking at the nitrogen release side of the balance, we actually have a cool new tool available. It's called Cover Crop NCalc, and it's available online. Basically, the tool predicts how much nitrogen release you can expect from a cover crop based on your particular environment. And so you enter into this tool the size of your cover crop, when you're terminating it, when you're planting the next crop. It does ask for an estimate of your nitrogen concentration, so that's what you may or may not have, but with that information, the tool will come up with a chart like this that shows in green here how much the cover crop has released over the course of the decay period. And then you also see here in yellow how much nitrogen uptake that next crop is, how much nitrogen the next crop is taking up. And so in this example, I used cereal rye, 5,000 pounds per acre dry matter in Frankfort, Kentucky, and you can see in 6 weeks it released about 20 pounds of nitrogen to that next crop. So again, not all of that will be necessarily a positive, because you also have to consider that depletion effect, but we're kind of trying to understand both sides of the balance, the usage and then the release. So I just played around with this tool for some different scenarios. So the left-hand side, you see the cereal rye that was the example I just gave. So a 5,000 pound per acre cover crop. Actually, the picture you see is probably bigger than 5,000 pounds per acre, but a C to N ratio of 45, which leads to a nitrogen content of that cover crop of 50 pounds per acre. And again, that release that was simulated was 20 pounds per acre. If we contrast that with the hairy vetch on the far right, that's going to be a less productive cover crop usually in terms of biomass, but it has a much lower C to N ratio. It's a legume cover crop, so that helps with the high nitrogen concentration. And it has a much higher nitrogen content. Again, it's getting a lot of its nitrogen from the atmosphere. And so the higher nitrogen content plus the high rate of nitrogen release due to that low carbon to nitrogen ratio, you see a lot higher simulated nitrogen release with that pure hairy vetch. And then the cereal rye hairy vetch mix kind of falls in between in all categories, so with a moderate nitrogen release of 44 pounds per acre. And I just want to highlight the hairy vetch kind of benefits in nitrogen in multiple ways, because it's not taking all of its nitrogen from the soil. It has less of a depletion effect, plus its low C to N ratio means it, and high nitrogen content means that it can release a lot. So in that sense, we see kind of why legumes are so much more beneficial for the nitrogen supply as compared to the grasses. And one way that we try to capture the effect of the cover crops on nitrogen supply is looking at how the subsequent crop deals with, basically how well the subsequent crop grows in the absence of other sources of nitrogen. And so you can see here for the cereal rye treatment, the corn following the rye is kind of looking smaller and yellower, whereas the corn following the vetch is looking bigger and greener. You'll also notice there's more weeds in the vetch, so that's a bit of a trade-off there, and one reason why you may consider that mix is kind of balancing the weed suppression benefit of the rye with the nitrogen supplying benefit of the vetch. So kind of using that approach, we looked at corn grain yield following different cover crops at a range of different locations across the U.S. So, they're actually in order from, I guess, going from highest to lowest, but we've got a kind of spanning the East Coast to Nebraska, as far north as Vermont, and south as North Carolina. But what we see here is if you have a positive bar, that means that the corn growing after the cover crop did better than corn growing following no cover crop in the absence of other nitrogen sources. So with the legume, you really see most of the sites did better following that legume. The mix was mixed and the rye was generally pretty negative. So it kind of matches with what we would predict from what I talked about in the last slide. In terms of trying to estimate the nitrogen credit or deficit from the cover crops, I did some estimating based on how much nitrogen different yielding corn would require. And so those higher bars, those higher red bars equate to about 25 pounds of nitrogen per acre, addition, and then the rye blue negative bars about negative 50. So I guess to answer the question that I posed at the beginning of this segment, it was a trick question because it does depend on the cover crop species, right? All right, so the other thing to think about with with nutrient management and organic systems, a lot of our organic materials that, apart from the cover crops, a lot of organic materials that we apply to provide nutrients do not necessarily include those nutrients in the appropriate balance for what the crop needs. So this is an example with some different types of animal manures. We have in yellow the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio of the crop, and then in brown, beef, swine, and poultry manure. And so in general, those manures have a lower nitrogen to phosphorus ratio than what the crop needs. And so this means that if you apply the animal manure to meet all of the nitrogen needs of the crop, it's adding extra phosphorus and also extra potassium, as it turns out. And that's not great because we know that phosphorus is a water quality concern. And also in the bluegrass region, we usually don't need to apply much phosphorus because our soils are naturally rich in P. And so this kind of leads to this idea of integrating a legume cover crop and animal manure to provide a more balanced supply of nitrogen and phosphorus. So it's just a scenario of a given corn crop with 150 bushel per acre yield. Based on the recommendations, this was an example from Maryland, so the recommendations for Kentucky might differ slightly for nitrogen. But assuming we want to apply 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, that corn crop would remove 60 pounds of phosphorus as P2O5 per acre. If we supplied all of the nitrogen that crop needed with poultry litter, we would be over applying our phosphorus, so it would be supplying 160 pounds of the P2O5 when we need 60. If we'd apply the phosphorus to meet the poultry litter to meet the phosphorus needs, we wouldn't be supplying enough nitrogen. So the question is, can we kind of provide the balance of nitrogen with either a mixture or a legume cover crop so that we can really fine-tune both our nitrogen and phosphorus supply in this system? So to test this, this is a study where we looked at a range of different cover crop proportions going from 100% hairy vetch to 100% cereal rye, and a few different mixtures in between. And superimposed on that, we had different poultry litter rates and application methods. And this was a organic system with a rather large cover crop that we rolled and crimped in mid-May. So it was a big cover crop. We waited until it was mature enough to be successfully roll or crimped. All right, so this is a complex yet beautiful figure that I'll try to explain, colorful at least. The y-axis here is the yield, the grain yield of the corn, following different cover crops. The x-axis is our nitrogen rate coming from the poultry litter. So what was the pounds of plant available nitrogen per acre supplied by the poultry litter? And we're going to focus first on that black line that's adjacent to the yellow color. And that's our yield response to poultry litter rate for our treatment with a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So what we were getting from that cereal rye. And so where the linear increase and the flat line join, does this have a laser? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. This is more complicated. Okay. Where the linear increase and the flat line meet, that's our optimum poultry litter rate. And you can see that's going to be further over, so right around between 90 and 180 pounds per acre in 2012 for our cereal rye. In contrast, when we look at the other end of that color spectrum, that's our response to poultry litter following the hairy vetch with our low C/N ratio. So that point there, which I think she's got the little cursor on right now, that's going to be our optimum poultry litter rate when following the hairy vetch. And then the different color gradients in between just represent those different mixtures. So the key message, and you can see we've got 3 years of that, all kind of a similar pattern. When we averaged those, we found that the optimum poultry litter nitrogen rate following the hairy vetch, so in that purple region, was 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And then the optimum poultry litter following the cereal rye was 146. So this just really emphasizes that if you're growing a legume cover crop like hairy vetch, you can really apply less poultry litter. And actually, if you recall, going back to this chart, that 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre supplied for the cover crop, or the 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre supplied from the poultry litter is basically right where that phosphorus rate should be. So just kind of pointing out that it seems we can actually integrate that legume cover crop with the poultry litter to get both the nitrogen and the phosphorus at a good balance. All right, yes? That is an option. However, just looking at this, you can see even in the purple region, without any poultry litter, you were not reaching the highest yield that you could. This is for corn, so maybe a less nitrogen demanding crop. You could meet all of your nitrogen needs from just the legume cover crop. But here you can see actually the crop usually benefited from some poultry litter in addition to that nitrogen, because we see that linear increase. Does that make sense? No?
Above normal for phosphorus,
Yes.
okay? So I wouldn't want to apply any, if I applied any manure, I'm just going to raise that level and make it even worse.
Okay, thanks. If you apply the poultry litter at the phosphorus-based rate, you're just applying enough phosphorus to match what's removed, so your phosphorus level is not going to further increase. And you could also just stop applying any animal manure and your phosphorus would start to go down. But I'm just saying here that your legume cover crop may not give you all the nitrogen that you need, so you might have to apply something else to get the nitrogen your crop needs. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. All right. So just to wrap up, I wanted to highlight that soil health improvement through cover crop use is an investment. And so we kind of talked about how certain cover crops like cereal rye, it uses water and it uses some nitrogen that may lead to some level of depletion during the growth period. But then it's providing a lot of benefits in terms of retaining water and releasing nitrogen, improving the organic matter in time. So what we see is sometimes, like we saw with the cover crop study Danielle presented, we'll see a yield decrease following cover crop adoption because some of those negative aspects of the resource depletion can outweigh the positive benefits from short-term cover crop use. As we build up the soil organic matter, we start to see that the positives begin to outweigh the negatives, and that's this blue line is representing the sum of those positives and negatives. And so, a lot of the nutrients that may be kind of preemptively taken from your cash crop, they're not taken from the system. They're going towards building the organic matter, and then in time you'll start to see how that organic matter benefits the system, like we saw in the long-term no-till plots. But those are, over 50 years old, so just recognizing that the full suite of benefits that you see from soil health, it will take some years of cover crop use to really start to see those. And that's just building up the soil organic matter. All right, and that concludes our slides. We wanted to acknowledge the nutrient cycling group, and especially the team that's been working on the long-term cover crop study led by Aaron Haramoto, and our funding sources. And I think if time allows, we would like to hear questions. Yes.
In your study about tilling, can you tell us what was the difference between no-till and till, and then what about harrowing? I mean, is there, like, you understand what I'm asking? Like, can I just till 1 to 3 inches of the ground?
Yeah, that's a good question that unfortunately we can't answer with that study, because basically it was originally converted from sod without even tillage in the no-till. So it was just sprayed and then direct seeded for the no-till. And then for the tilled, it's moldboard plowed every spring. And it gets a cover crop every winter, and otherwise it's continuous corn. So it's really, an extreme tillage situation. It's the most disruptive kind of tillage that we could do. I do think that a shallow and infrequent tillage is not going to destroy the soil health in the way that moldboard plowing does. And in fact, I think we've read some studies with the occasional tillage, you actually can retain a lot of the soil benefits of no-till. So I think that, and a lot of the benefits of the no-till is really the residue. So just maintaining some residue coverage through minimum tillage. I think that is where a lot of the aggregate and infiltration, water improvement benefits come from.
So on the percent of soil carbon between the plowing and the no-till on that study, was that like 0.6% difference, like change over those 8 years? Or is that like since 1970 of doing these two systems, there's like 0.5% of difference between the two sides?
Yeah,
The
so
second one?
that's the soil organic carbon percentages that were measured. It was like 3 or 4 years ago, so after about 50 years of those systems.
Right. And how do they compare to soil organic matter? Is it similarly like a tiny difference, or like when you're moldboard plowing versus chemical no-till? Is it that small of a difference in soil organic matter after 50 years?
Yeah, so the soil organic matter is approximately 2 times soil organic carbon. I think the strict conversion factor is 1.72. So it's basically, if you just multiply those numbers by about 2, you would get the soil organic matter. So, yeah.
It's like 2 to 3% organic matter at the place. It seems like if you wanted to compare and see what cover crops could do, like you might need to put them somewhere where there's more biological activity and sort of like less extreme scenario. Like,
Yeah, this.
or sort of like what he said, like, oh, maybe if we till just a little bit and maybe, yeah.
Yeah. I will address a couple aspects. So on one hand, I think the expectation about how much soil organic carbon or soil organic matter can change versus the reality of what we measure in research studies are different. And that's part of why I wanted to show this. These are 2 extremely different soil disruption levels, but the percentage point difference that we see is less than 1%. So just to highlight, after 50 years, moldboard plowing every single year versus continually leaving it undisturbed, we get less than a 1 percentage point change. And that, just to put into perspective what you can expect on your farms in terms of carbon changes.
But you haven't built any organic matter in 50 years. I mean, or like you're at 3% in 50 years. So that's saying that like whatever you're doing is not the thing that like eco-ag people are trying to do. So like if you were in a situation where you built your farm and you were at 5% organic matter because you'd like really been hustling and building residue and you'd been activating your biology, would it still be such a tiny difference? And are there studies that are looking at that instead of looking at like a conventional chemical ridge top, corn every year?
Yeah, so this is the example that I have. The continuous corn system with the cover crop is about as much biomass as you can get into a field because corn produces a huge amount of biomass, and then you add in a cover crop and that's a lot of carbon inputs actually. So you could get much higher if you were putting compost or animal manure on, but that's actually bringing carbon from another location. So in terms of how much you can actually fix in terms of photosynthesis, like on that piece of ground, a continuous corn system with a cover crop is actually a lot of residue going in. Yes, that is true. In the continuous corn, you have to apply nitrogen. But yeah, so other systems, you could add a lot of compost or animal manure, and you would get higher levels of organic matter probably. Yes.
You may have already covered it, but a lot of the opinion is that if you transition to organic, it's going to be more profitable. So if you use cover crops over the years, would it be more, would it increase your profitability versus not using cover crops?
Yeah, so cover crops have a cost, and they don't, like, you're not selling a product with the cover crop. So you're really counting on that, you know, in time that they're going to either reduce your input requirements or increase your yields so that you're able to sell more product. And I think the jury is still out in terms of how cover crops affect yield. We project that with long-term use that they will benefit yield, but we don't have a whole lot of long-term studies like where we really see that effect that I showed kind of hypothetically at the end. So if you can use a cover crop that replaces your nitrogen, if you're not having to apply nitrogen fertilizer, then that's a cost reduction. So that may be a way to make them profitable.